today I've asked them to open the program by singing the Air Force song. I was born in Rexburg, Idaho in 1921, and 2 years after that we moved to Montana, to the Red Lodge area, if any of you are familiar with Montana. This was in 1923, of course, that we moved there, and 6 years later we had bought a farm. My father had bought a farm, and we were going to be both sheepman and cattleman in Montana, we thought, when we moved there. But this was in 1920, but in 1929 he passed away with lung cancer. And of course, even though there were 7 us boys, and they attempted, my older brothers, I happened to be the youngest, so I was just a baby at that time, but older brothers was going to take over and run the farm. But I'm sure many of you here know what happened in 29 and 30 and 31. The Depression came about, and so we, with many others, lost our farm, foreclosed on us, and we lost all the cattle and sheep. So I moved back to Teton Basin. That's where my mother was raised as a girl, and her mother was still alive at that time and was living in that area, and so we moved back to Teton Basin. I spent 2 years, or the next 5 years, in school there, finishing my elementary and going through high school. And then I had a desire. The farm was too small that we had at that time to divide among 7 boys, and I was the youngest. So I decided I had to get an education. And I spent 1 year at the University of Idaho Southern Branch then, in chemistry. But I had an older brother that was moving to Logan because he was in the field of agriculture, and so he took his little brother with him down to Logan, and I started school at Logan. Now, the war was moving forward in both the European theater and the Pacific theater at that time. And so in order to continue school, you had to do something about it to get a deferment. And so I joined the Air Force Reserve on campus there at Utah State. But it wasn't long after that, as you all know through your history, that Pearl Harbor arrived. And before the hour was over on campus, the announcements were that all of the reserve programs would be canceled, and that the students, of course, would be called into the service. So within 30 days, I was being mustered in at Fort Douglas in Salt Lake. Being a member of the Air Corps, Santa Ana at that time, and is still, the center where they start the cadet programs. We went down there, or we're going down there for indoctrination. But I should say just for a few days, because there were too many getting in the service all at once. They couldn't handle us, and so we spent 30 days marching in the mud at Kearns, Utah. 25 of those days we were even without our uniforms. So you can imagine how we looked for the time of 30 days.
What time of the year was this?
This was in January. And so we, another few days, and we were put on the train and sent to San Ana. That was the place for indoctrination for the cadets. And we did a lot of marching down there. You know, you can't be in the service and be under the jurisdiction of the leaders without, you have to march a little. And so we spent Sundays parading for a few weeks. But we weren't there long until we started into our flight training. My first stop in flight training was in Visalia, California. We were flying single engine, single wing plane, very small, but they were big enough to be very adequate for training. The challenge was, of course, they wanted to find out whether you were really a candidate for flight training. So our first flight was what they termed at Visalia the ring-out flight. And they would, with the instructor at the controls, we were put in the plane and taken for a ride. And each did everything that the plane was capable of doing to see how we would react to it. And many of the students were washed out at that point. They didn't want to start a training program with young men that were going to have problems that they felt they had diagnosed initially, and they did. There were a lot of them that stopped at that point, but I got along fine. And so within the next few weeks, I was in flight training. And they expected you to solo in 8 hours, and if you couldn't make it, that was another reason for you to be washed out. But we spent just a few weeks there, and then I was sent north to Chico, where there was what we call basic training, much larger plane and much more powerful plane. But still, we spent the time doing exactly the same thing: landings, takeoff, maneuverability of the planes in the area. I might say that at Visalia, the terrain that we flew over there was 70% grape vineyards and 30% cow pastures, because they had a lot of cattle in that area. And every time we got in the air, it was a custom of the instructors occasionally to pull off the power, but if not, they would ask you, where could you land immediately? They wanted us to be aware that if there was pastures about, we had to know where they were at all times. So if we had troubles, we could get into them. And luckily, this was a valuable training, because at about 18 hours, I was up solo one day and my plane engine stopped. Luckily, I got into a cow pasture, had a little bit of problem. The fence came a little too quick and I broke off the propeller, but other than that, got along very fine.
And there's a picture of Cadet Rigby.
Oh my gosh.
Then in Chico, we spent the basic training was somewhat the same, half-day ground school, half-day flying. It wasn't until we got into advanced training, which was the third field, that we started the night time flying. And then, of course, it gave us a few more hours of the day to use in the training purposes, but basically it went on much the same. And by the time I had my advanced training at Stockton, California, so my whole time in training was in California. That might be an advantage and it might be a disadvantage. The reason I say that is In California, no matter which direction you look, you can see mountains, so you've got a horizon. I finally got down in the southern part of the country where there are no mountains, and it's quite different. You go up at night, unless you're watching your instruments closely, you don't know whether you're seeing a house light on the ground or whether you're seeing a star in the sky. There's no horizon to determine that, so you have to fly by instruments much of the time at night in those cases. But I soon finished my training at Stockton, was ready for graduation. And of course, that was a proud day in the lives of young cadets. We were to get our commissions, a second lieutenant, and our wings to prove that we had been trained to handle planes. This shows a picture of me. They did give us 30-day leave at this point so that we could go home and show off our uniforms and brag about our wings. That's what young men do many times. And so, but while I was home, I got my orders for further training, and I was assigned to go to Hobbs, New Mexico to fly B-17. This is quite different. Till this time, your training had been you alone with your instructor. But when you get into B-17s, then you have a pilot and a co-pilot, and of course, as many of you who have had those experiences know, there's quite a lot more that you have to know when you take off in B-17. We spent most of our time at Hobbs, New Mexico, in first of all, learning how to land and take off the B-17. It's not a small project in itself. You have to have had considerable experience, and then when you add to that, which we were going to eventually, a bomb load and a gas load, 25 50-gallon drums in each wing, it makes quite a difference in what you must do in order to take off and the things you have to know.
So the completion of your training there, then you were sent to Lincoln?
I was sent to Lincoln, Nebraska, and that was the staging area and the place where all crews were put together for the whole nation. And so we went into Lincoln, Nebraska, and there we picked up our crew. And our assignment, of course, they went many directions from there, but our assignment was to go to Dyersburg, Tennessee. And for an Idaho boy who probably until he was 18 years old didn't know there was anything but mountains and snow drifts around, it was tough to go to an area like Dyersburg, Tennessee, with the temperature at midnight many times the same as it was at noonday, about 100, and the humidity at 75 and up, because we were right along the banks of the Mississippi River. But Dyersburg proved to be an interesting place. When we got there, we were divided, of course, up. The pilots, who were then going to be the first pilots of the plane, were taken into a meeting separate from all the rest of their crews. And I have 2 or 3 statements that I'd like to read that the commander there gave us right out of his working materials. He says, "Welcome to Dyersburg, gentlemen. You have come here for a great purpose." I better put on my glasses so I can see what I'm saying. Read. "You have come here for a great purpose. 560 men came on this base today. When they leave here approximately 10 weeks from now, there will be 56 properly trained combat crews ready for combat, if each one of you perform your jobs properly. It will be a period of full hard work. Not only your success in future life, but your life itself depends on how much you learn here. If I should ask you what your duty was. Now, as you remember, I said only the pilots were there in that meeting. If I should ask you what your duties was, all of you would probably say, I'm the first pilot on the B-17. That is true today, but tomorrow you become the airplane commander. What is an airplane commander, and what are his duties? I'm sure this is the question that's running through the minds of most of you. That is a question that will take many months to answer. But briefly, here it is. Your primary duty is command. Flying is secondary. A leader exercising command properly is the only difference between an army and a mob. It is your duty to make sure that your crew becomes a team, not a mob. And so our training there for 10 weeks at Dyersburg was very intense, and we were trained from that point on as crews, not as individuals. Supposedly we each had come through our specialty and knew what was going on as far as the special end of it was concerned, but we had to work as a crew because, as he mentioned, our lives depended on it, and I'm sure that all of you who have flown missions and who have had those experiences knows what the challenges are.
So at that point, you had gone through a lot of training. What was your final assignment then going to be?
We left there and went back to Lincoln, Nebraska to pick up our orders, and we were assigned to go to the 15th Air Force, 2nd Bomb Group in Foggia, Italy. And in addition to that, we were assigned to pick up a new plane in Lincoln, and was to fly up to Foggia. Now the question will probably be asked, did you have your own plane the rest of your tour of duty? And the answer is no. And they told us right in Lincoln, they said, you're responsible for and flying this plane to Foggia, but it will be put in the cooler. And this was wise, as we see from, as we had that experience, that this was a wise move. But they told us what our course would be. They said, you will leave Lincoln, Nebraska, go to Bangor, Maine, then to Newfoundland, next to the Azores, and from there to Marrakesh, Africa, where we had a 3-day layover. It happened to be a Jewish holiday, and I'm sure that was part of the reason. We found out my name's Rigby and my bombardier's name was Herring, and we thought maybe we could get a pass to get off the post. And all they said that to us when they looked at us, those names don't sound Jewish to us. So, of course, we didn't get off the post. We were there 3 days before we left. The next flight was our flight into Foggia. I'd show you where Foggia is. It's on the very right hand on the Adriatic side of Foggia, of Italy. Clear down where we have the little circle is the area where we flew out of. That's Foggia, Italy. The Bari is a seacoast town very close to where we were, but that's where all of our missions were to be. And our missions were going to be to Czechoslovakia, to Austria, to Hungary, to Romania, and to Bulgaria. And if all of you who know your geography well knows that the Alps are between where you're starting from and where you've got to be.
The generic Alps.
You might?
The generic Alps.
Yeah.
Didn't you go to Tunis before you went to go to Joya?
No.
They sent us to same route.
We didn't go to Tunis, no.
And
We went
then
to,
we stayed in Tunis for a long time and then went over to Joya and then into Foggia.
I don't know, is that further north or further south? I don't know.
It's further south, it's way down.
That's what we had the northern route, and that is what they
Well,
told
we
us.
went the same route, and I gotta tell you about Joya. We went in there, And we just landed and we were taxiing, and there was a B-24. And it had written from one end to the other in letters about like that, consolidated mess.
So after you arrived there, you said there was a lot of interest in the new people arriving there, talking to those who had been there for a little bit.
Right. The first thing you want to know is what have we gotten ourselves into? And so, and I don't know that this was the right place to go for information, but we went to those who had just been for flying mission. So you got all kinds of stories and all kinds of tales. Some of them completely actual and some of them pretty fantastic. So that I found that you soon had to pretty well decide yourself which one you want to believe and you had to find out for yourself what they were talking about through their own experiences. My first mission, being the pilot of the concern, or the commander, was to fly with our squadron commander in his ship with his crew. So I was there individually from as far as our crew is concerned, but this was their pattern. Let the pilot go first, and then he can explain to his crew members what their problems and what their challenges would be. And so we went, our first mission was to go into the marshalling yards in Budapest, Hungary, and bomb the marshalling yards. Now, I'm sure you all know what marshalling yards are. Those are the railroad yards. That's where all of their materials that they're trying to move are located, as well as many of their oil tanks and that type of thing. So our targets, while we were in this area, nearly 100% were either marshalling yards or oil refineries. And so we went on this particular day, as I'm telling you, to the marshalling yards at Budapest. We knew before we left home that we were all 28 planes. We went as a group, and for those who have flown B-17s, they know what a workout this is. For those who haven't, it is a workout. For example, we would take off at our base at Foggia, and 2 hours later, we were still circling over our base, attempting to get enough altitude to be able to go over the Alps. So you watch the planes of our day take off, and they take off about this angle and go right up to 30,000 feet in a very short time. With a bomb load of 2,000 pounds and 2,500 gallons of gas, you didn't fly B-17s at that rate. It took hours to get enough altitude to go over the Alps and to get into the target area.
So that first mission, what was it like for you?
We actually had a very smooth mission, and I guess I was glad that first day that I had the squadron commander at main control, because he had had a lot of experience, but it did go smoothly. We went in on our target. The thing I would like to mention here, that the guns on the ground, the 88 millimeters and the 105 millimeter guns, did not have at that time what you call contact fuses. In other words, they had to cut their fuse to explode at the altitude that they calculated that you were at. And luckily, they didn't always calculate the right altitude, but in order to throw them off, usually we attempt to do either drop 1,000 feet or climb 1,000 feet. That was decided by the commander of the flight, to change the altitude by 1,000 feet, which in many times made quite a difference in whether they were able to reach you, because those bombs that size, or their shells that size, can do a lot of damage if it's even close to where you are. Didn't have to be direct hits to take a plane out. And so we went through and made our bomb run, turned back onto our course home, and immediately upon going out of the target area, the fighter escort picked us up again. We had P-51s always that we used. There were other fighter groups that had 38s in the area, but ours was P-51. And it was always good to see them come in. Never good to see the enemy. But luckily, people keep saying, well, what did you see the enemy do? To be truthful with you, when you're flying a mission and have all of the responsibilities that you do to accomplish, you don't see anything that the enemy does. We just depend on our fighter escort to make sure that they don't reach us. Because there's not time just to be gazing around and seeing. And by the same token, very frequently did we see other planes go down, or in cases where there were bailouts, did we see them bail out? Generally, no. Your job was to fly your mission, drop your bomb, and come home and bring the plane home safely.
So you had experienced a mission before the rest of your crew did. What was it like to get them ready for their first mission?
So what was the date of this first mission?
You what?
The date of your first mission.
I can't tell you the day. We got over there in about the 21st of August, but, so they were in
What year?
44.
44?
Oh, what year? In 44.
Yeah.
I see. I didn't keep track of dates. I didn't know. I only knew when Sunday came.
So how did you prepare your crew to?
Well, this is a challenge because it's difficult to tell someone else what you experience as you're flying a mission. And as I talked to my crew, and this was our responsibility, was to prepare them that they might know what to experience on their own. And so as I talked to 9 men, I found that there was almost 9 different reactions. Some of them, of course, responded outwardly. You could see their response. Others, of course, kept it internally. You didn't really know what was going through their mind. And I wasn't a psychologist, and so it was difficult to know what you could do to help your crew to prepare. As I watched them through the next 10 months, the time that it took us to fly our mission, I found out that the same thing was going on constantly in their minds. Some of them were accepting it quite readily, getting along very fine. Others were tied up as tight as a drum because of the fear of what might happen. And so it was hard to have them prepared, even so, for their first mission.
So as you mentioned, nearly most of your missions, show on the next slide, were to the oil refineries and the railroad yards in those various countries: Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. And then you were saying you did make 1 mission to Germany and 3 low-altitude missions to northern Italy.
Right. I don't know how many 8th Air Force pilots we have here, but I think the 15th Air Force had the feeling many times that what came out in the papers and what is given as we hear the news today, the 8th Air Force got 90% of the credit. And so frequently in our bombing missions, when we go in the morning be told what was to happen that day, frequently you'd hear the expression, well, one of these days they might even send us to Berlin. And one of these days they did send us to Berlin. A mission really that was too long for us. We really didn't have the lead ships got along fairly well. And we did bomb the Marshman yards in Germany, in Berlin. The lead ships got along pretty well, but the tail end ships who have to jockey their power all day had a tough time, and some of them had to land at landing fields that we had in northern Italy for that purpose. And so only one mission went to Germany. We did fly 3 missions to low altitude missions over the troop forces in northern Italy. This I didn't like. We were carrying incendiary bombs, and I just didn't like the idea of dropping bombs on troops, whether they're ours or whether they weren't ours. But they were, we knew our troops were somewhere, maybe receiving that. It was not a good feeling, but we still had missions that were sent there. We were there for one purpose, and that was to win the war. And so we did what we were told to do.
It's been interesting to hear you describe kind of what your day-to-day living conditions were like, what you lived in.
Well, when we got to Italy, the officers were given, the 4 officers on a crew were given a tent, and you set it up, and that was your home for the next 10 months. After we had flown for a number of missions, we got tired of going home to a tent. And so we made, the 4 of us got together and we decided we were going to approach some of the Masons. There were many Italian people that worked in the areas there. They did many things for the army as well as for personnel in that area. And so we got acquainted with some Masons, and we asked them to build us a 4x4 the size of the tent up to the square.
Put your hair on.
And then they put the tent on top. Now, to many of you might say, well, that doesn't look much like a home. But to those who were living in tents, they thought that was a great home. We had lots of chance to have others come in and spend a little time with us, including the commander of our squadron, who was a chess player, and so was my navigator, a good chess player. So he spent quite a few hours there playing chess with my volunteers.
And you even rigged in a little plumbing.
But we built in, you can see we put a tank, and we were able to get this water tank and plumbed it in. Now, this was not for the purpose of showering and that type of thing. We had buildings that were built for the Air Force officers to take care of their bathroom needs. But it was nice to have a sink, so that when the bell rang and you were going to go to eat your next meal, at least you could wash your hands quickly and still make it over there, not to be at the end of the line. And so we thought this turned out to be the envy of the whole squadron, the home that we built.
How did you heat it?
We had alcohol burners, but we didn't heat it really.
You didn't rig one of those gasoline, like airplane gas stoves?
We didn't get into it that far. We thought the fact that we had stools in there to sit on and a table to work on, play chess at least, we felt that we had improved our situation considerably. Beat sitting on your cot all the time.
So can you tell us, were there any of your missions that stand out particularly in your mind as being difficult or memorable to you?
Well, there is one mission that was the mission I felt of my tour of duty, and that was to Ploesti, Romaina. We were told the morning that we were told that where we were going, that we would go in at 25,000 feet. Now that's a little lower than we bombed usually at marshalling yards. But they picked that altitude because it was just a little bit above what the cloud layer was predicted to be that day. And so we took off and went into the target area. We happened to be flying the left wing of the lead ship. And to those of you who have flown formations, know that that's probably one of the most ideal places in formation, because you can see what the lead ship is doing, and by the same token, you are not having to jockey your power to the degree that the tailman Chuck had to do, who was number 7 in the squadron. And we were going in on our target. We found that all was going well at that time. We were just above the clouds, just actually skimming the clouds. We went in and dropped our bombs, and within seconds after we dropped our bombs, we had a hit. And we didn't know exactly at first what it was, but we decided later that it was a 105 millimeter shell from the ground. It had not exploded in our ship, but it had gone through, leaving a hole in the side of the fuselage about the size that you could drive a Jeep through. And so but the percussion and the things that take place right at that point in time, we probably dropped 2,500 feet, maybe 2,000, maybe 3,000 feet. So we were into the clouds completely, out of formation. And of course, the thing that causes you to worry at a time like that is where are all the other ships that are in that same area, because many times more than one group would bomb the same target if they felt there was something to be gained by it. But we had no choices at that point. We decided as a crew that we would set our course to go home. I called the navigator and he gave me the heading that was necessary to set the plane on to head to our home base. We could determine that our plane, even though the engineer went back and determined the size of the structure, the size of the hole in the structure, we still decided that we were going to try to stay with the plane and go home. I had an engineer who invariably, as soon as anything out of line happened, he'd say, should we get ready to bail out? And I said, not as long as we can stay in, I'm not bailing. And so anyhow, we made the decision to head home. Then you're alone. And luckily, we were in the clouds completely at first, and then finally had intermittent clouds, which was a good thing because it didn't give enemy fighter planes an opportunity to pick you up because you weren't out there where they could see you that often. So we headed home. As soon as we got close enough to the home base to get radio contact, we told them what our situation was and what should we do about it. And of course they agreed with it. You should attempt to come home, bring the plane home. No one encouraged to bail out even then. And so we went home, got radio contact when we were in the area of our base. They were ready for us. They cleared the port for our landing and made sure that they had equipment available. We didn't know at that point just what kind of damage we might have on the plane and what the landing would do. But I decided, or the pilot and co-pilot decided together, that we would make our landing at a higher speed so that we had a little more control and still have the possibility of going around if necessary. But we did go in and land, and we were all amazed. I'm sure that each of us had spent much time by that time praying about what might happen. We landed, we rolled to stop the plane, and then got instructions from the ground crew as to where we should park the plane, and got out and was grateful when we got on old terra firma to know that we were home and safe and sound. It wasn't many days after this happening that we got word through our squadron commander that we had been cited for the Distinguished Flying Cross for the return ship to home base. And this is a time when you wish all of your crew had the same status as the commander does, but it just so happens, like so many things in this life, there's one person that seems to get the credit. I mean, so far, as I hear people talk about, they say, I got the Distinguished Flying Cross. Well, I feel we got the Distinguished Flying Cross because we worked as a crew to bring the plane home.
Well, with all the stress of flying mission after mission, was there opportunity to get away and relax a little bit?
The Air Force saw to it that men, when they reached a certain point, and how, depending on how they were accepting the challenges that they had, should have a rest camp. And there were a number of rest camps available for the 15th Air Force. Some of them even as far away as Cairo, Egypt, one at Casablanca, in Northern Africa, one in Sicily, and of course the ones that were most convenient were Rome and Naples, because they were just across this mountain range from us. And so our time, my navigator and I were the first to take rest camp leave, and we went to Rome. Now, I was grateful to go with my navigator. He was not a member of the church, but he had ideals and ideas that were very similar to my own. And so we decided that we wanted to go to our rest camp together. He was different than a kid from Idaho. He'd been raised in Texas. He was fairly well educated, a little older than I was. But we decided to go to Rome together, and we sat down to decide what we could do in Rome. I might mention that word that I hear President Hinckley use so frequently. You know, when you go on rest camp and you hear the reports of those who come back, President Hinckley would say there's too much sleaziness going on. And so I was grateful to be with Paul Wilson, and we decided that we would spend the first 4 days in Rome, and then we had the opportunity to spend the next 3 days at the Isle of Crete. And of course, we were on, this was the idea, we were to have a rest camp. But in Rome, we spent the day seeing some of the sights of Rome, such as the Vatican City and the Colosseum, many of the art museums. In the evening, Paul wanted to go to operas. I had never seen an opera in my life, but I wanted to do what Paul wanted to do. And luckily, he knew well enough what he wanted to see that he was able to keep me appraised of what was going on. I believe I even got half as much out of it as he did. Enjoyed it very much. And we went 3 nights, and you can imagine 3 operas in a row. Haven't seen one since, and haven't seen one prior to this. Yeah. But the next 3 days we spent at the Isles of Crete, which, in my opinion, for a country boy, was a little more relaxing. There were lots of sights to be seen there and entertainments to follow through on. And so we had a great time together. We returned after 7 days, much refurbished, much in better situation to get back into the activity of flying missions.
So you said the day finally came when you reached that 35th mission and your missions were complete, and what happened at that point?
Well, you're right. The 35th mission was the one we always looked for. And how grateful we were when that day came. But then we knew that because the Army works pretty much with like clock. I mean, when you're through with one thing, you should get into another. And so we knew immediately, as soon as our tour of duty was over, that we would head home. They did give us a choice at that time as to how we would come home. The one choice was to fly a war-weary B-17 back to the United States. The other choice was to come by boat, or by troop transport. And I felt that we had flown a good, a brand new plane over the ocean, why take a chance and fly one that's war weary back?
You
So-
might meet up with the one that had the hole in it from digging up their Jeep.
So we decided to come back
Mines.
by
Still
troop
submarines.
transport, and so that meant that we had to be sent to Naples, because that's where they shipped all of the people back to the United States out of, was Naples. And we went there, and of course there are times when the Army does the things, you wonder whether they know for sure what they're doing, and to get to that many men together to send them home on board ship was a big chore for them, I'm sure. So we were in Naples 30 days. During that time, VE Day came along, the 8th of May, I believe, is right, on VE Day. And so we were grateful, even so, to be on our way home. Something about the idea that you're through and to get out of the combat region, at least, meant something to you. And so we got aboard the boat, and they told us very emphatically that if you want to get home without getting seasick. Of course, we were all flying, and so really we should have been used to motion sickness, or used to motion and not get sick. But there were a lot aboard our ship that did get sick, but their instructions was, if you'll eat regularly, good-sized meal, and then keep your mind and your bodies active, you don't have to get sick going home. And luckily, this was not true with everybody on board ship, but this was true for me. I made the trip home 7 days from there to Newport News, Virginia. We landed, and
So once landing in Virginia, how did you make the rest of the trip?
well, we still had to get across, in our case, we still had to get clear across the nation. And the Army has certain methods that they work by. And so each port of entry across the country, or each station across the country, had to have their men set up to be received in their particular area. Ours, of course, was to go to Fort Douglas, and we just had, as I recall, about 26 men on board that ship that were to go to Fort Douglas. 24 of those were enlisted men, and 2 of us as officers, and it just so happened that I was lucky enough to have the highest rank, so I got to have the responsibility of taking them across the nation. This was quite different from working with my crew. I had gotten close enough to my crew that I knew just about what to expect from each one of them at any time. But with 26 young men that you didn't know that you could expect them to do most anything but what you thought they ought to do at any particular time. But we got across the country. The trip on the train was not as much fun as the trip on the ocean, but it only lasted half as long, so we were soon to Fort Douglas.
And so what happened once you arrived at Fort Douglas?
Well, when we got to Fort Douglas, the first message I heard was, you know, you've been overseas, had an overseas tour of duty, and the war is over in Europe, so if you're interested in getting out, you're eligible for separation. And I thought to myself, well, I have captain's ranking, I have half that much more for flight pay. I've never earned that kind of money in my life. My days before I went into the service, I worked many of them for $1 a day on the farm. And I thought, I don't want to get out in a cruel, cold world without any salary. And so I debated in my own mind as to what I should do, but after talking to some, I had a number of relatives in the Salt Lake area that I had a chance to meet that next day. And also I called my mother. I told her what the situation was, that I was eligible for separation if I wanted to get out, but I wasn't sure whether that was a wise move. And even though her first statement was a little bit surprising to me. She said, well, you have greater wisdom than I do. You do what you think is best for you. And then we talked on about a number of things, and I hung up, and within an hour of that time, she called me back. And she said, I want you to know for sure that we would be happy for you to come home. Don't get the feeling that we aren't interested in that. And so I thought about that night, and the next day I went back to the base, and the officers that we were working with were still telling us what various possibilities were for us to do. But we were eligible for separation if that's what we would like to do. And while I was talking to him there was a couple of young men sitting there who was listening to the conversation. They had just returned home from the Pacific. They were flight officers themselves, but they were home on health reason. And one of them came over to me and he said, you know, I've heard what you said about getting out. He said, my advice to you, if you don't get out, you're crazy. And so I thought, well, I've had two such remarks. Maybe I'm trying to be told something. And so within the next 2 days of processing there at Fort Douglas, I became a civilian and headed home as a civilian.
Well, it's been great for me to get to hear a little more in detail about Dad's experiences, and I know that the way he met his challenges and faced his missions has had an influence on us as his children. I've always been impressed with how he talked about his crew, and you can get a little bit of a feeling today how much concern he had for his crew and how interested he was in their welfare, and I think that's not unlike the interest and the concern he has always had for us as his family. On one occasion he talked about after flying commercially, after getting home and making a sudden drop in altitude, he said, I always wish that I had kept my crew members a little more informed on what was going on, why we were being jolted around, because he said we as the pilot and co-pilot kind of know what's happening, but I'm sure for the men back in the plane it would have been helped calm their fears by letting them know what was going on. And so I think we're blessed by a dad who has set a great example for us, and so we wanted to just do a final song for you, dedicate it to our dad, who faces probably one of his toughest missions now in caring for our mom who has Alzheimer's, and also to dedicate it to each of you whose actions have influenced the generations that come behind you. And so we'll sing There's a Long, Long Trail.
Well, thank you very much. Everybody really enjoyed